Well, welcome everyone to another edition of this fall's webinar series on improving restorations. Today's presentations will be about building collaborations and improving restorations and learning as we go. We have two top-notch presenters with us here today. The first off is Peter Dicer. He's with the Minnesota Public Lands. He is the Minnesota Public Lands Coordinator for the American Bird Conservancy, where he identifies habitats for restoration and implements conservation projects on the ground. Prior to joining American Bird Conservancy, Peter received a Master of Science in Natural Resource Science and Management from the University of Minnesota and worked as a naturalist at Eagle Bluff Environmental Learning Center. He's based in Tamarac National Wildlife Refuge near Detroit Lakes. We're very happy to have Peter with us here today. And the second presenter today will be, waiting for that slide switch.
It's waiting.
Our second presenter will be Dr. Jeff Larkin. He is a professor of wildlife ecology and conservation at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Since 2011, he's worked closely with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service to deliver conservation programs to benefit forests, forest birds, and forest owners. Jeff also serves as the Forest Birds Habitat Coordinator for the American Bird Conservancy, where he directs a team of conservation planners and foresters who assist NRCS with the delivery of private lands conservation programs and target forest wildlife, including golden-winged warblers, American woodcock, cerulean warblers throughout the Appalachian and Great Lakes states. And we'll be hearing about some of that today. We're very excited to have Peter and Jeff with us. So if anyone listening today has questions that they would like the presenters to field, we should have a full 20 minutes at the end of this webinar to have a discussion and Q&A session with Jeff and Peter. So please put those questions into the Q&A box. And if you have other technical questions, you can put that into the chat. But in your Zoom window, look for that Q&A box when you have questions. And please infill those along the way as folks are presenting, and we'll sort of consolidate those for a discussion Q&A at the end. Next slide. And please, after the presentation, you will get a pop-up window asking you to fill out a short survey. This is a really valuable resource, both for us in the Restoration Evaluation Program at DNR and for the Use Restoring Minnesota program about where people's interests are in the types of restoration trainings that they'd like to see and some topics that we might want to see in the future. So please take a minute. This is valuable information for us. If you missed something or would like to see any of the webinars that have been presented in the past in this series, the link is right there. You can go to the Restoring Minnesota page on University of Minnesota Extension's website, and this webinar, as well as any of the presentations from the past, will be posted there. Next slide. We have two more webinars coming up in this ongoing series presented every 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now, we'll be discussing buckthorn, the ongoing challenge. That's on November 4th. And then on November 18th, Minnesota State seed mixes, a recipe for success. So all really good germane topics for practitioners in restoration in Minnesota. This webinar series is also supported and promoting the Ecological Restoration Certificate Program, which is coordinated through the University of Minnesota Extension. And it has opportunities to walk both practitioners in the field and early career practitioners through some of the basics of restoration practice. And it is a certificate program, really excellent resource in the state of Minnesota. And I encourage folks even beyond the state of Minnesota to check that out and spread the word about that. And finally, I am coming from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, as well as the Board of Water and Soil Resources from the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. Our charge is to review work that is happening through Minnesota's legacy funds in restoration on the ground And we work with experts in the field, identify challenges that are out there, see what's working and what's opportunities for improvement, and then also share information about ways that we can hopefully improve restoration practice in the future. Our URL is there, so please tune into that. And next slide is going back to the presentation. Without further ado, I will let Peter take it away for the first part of this presentation. Thank you. Peter, I think you're on mute.
Of course I was. Can you see my presentation?
Yep, looks good.
All right, great.
Thanks, Peter.
So, yeah, as mentioned, I'm the American Bird Conservancy Public Lands Coordinator here in Minnesota. And so my program is the story of a pretty grassroots blue collar program, relatively small, but touches a lot of different partners, a lot of different acres across Minnesota's forested landscape. And just to take the tour of like, who is American Bird Conservancy? Some of these slides have been used in a number of occasions, so I won't necessarily read every word on each one of them. But as I share what I do and how collaboration is so important to that endeavor, it's also really important to kind of touch on who ABC is and what actually needs to happen for my work to get done. So ABC lives on a, kind of defines itself within the context of a conservation pyramid, the base of which is building capacity, building those partnerships, supporting science, helping to raise funds or implement conservation initiatives. And then on top of that, we build from there, work to eliminate threats for all birds, conserve habitat of watchlist species, which is what I tend to do the most here in Minnesota, and halt extinctions of the rarest species. And we do that and have done that since 1994 and work across the Americas. So not only North America, Central and South America, the entire Western hemisphere kind of fall within our purview. And so I work for a suite of species, but kind of the stewardship flagship species here in Minnesota is the Golden-winged Warbler. Kind of that work is hand in hand with work for American Woodcock and Rough Grouse under the context of my 3 phases of Outdoor Heritage Fund dollars. They're a neotropical migratory songbird. About 47% visit Minnesota during the nesting season, which is what makes Minnesota sort of the Alamo for the species and just incredibly important for their long-term survival. They've declined about 60 to 70% over the last 50 years, since about 1966 when we started tracking those numbers. Males use a diverse woody structure in kind of a young forest habitat. They need that diverse structure of retention for song perches and forage. So young forest as a ground nester is important, but so is multiple levels of diversity, both within the context of their nesting areas and in the adjacent neighborhood of stands as well. There are deciduous forest species that'll abandon these openings and go into the adjacent forest. They're a foliage gleaner. They will eat some other insects, but they tend to love those leaf rolling caterpillars. And their habitat loss has really been the greatest driver of population loss. Loss of breeding habitat, stopover habitat, winter habitat. Much of that associated with human development, fragmentation, and parcelization. And lesser factors are nest parasitism and hybridization with the blue-winged warbler, which are greater impacts in different areas than in Minnesota, though some of that indeed happens here as well. So I create habitat by partnering with public land organizations, county, federal, state, and tribal, to implement mostly this top left stuff, mechanical brush treatment. I usually work in non-commercial habitat types. I'm kind of sometimes known as the brush guy. I go to those spots that not a lot of people want to go and fight against, where there's the most ticks and mosquitoes, and emulate natural disturbance. And I'm a proponent for retaining more during harvests, retaining more in a, both vertical and horizontal structure, as individually spaced trees and legacy patches are super important for these young forest species. And I emulate that within the context of brushland habitats as well that are situated in a deciduous forest habitat also. And I've also worked, we emulate natural disturbance, and a lot of that was fire years ago. So in some cases, we'll implement prescribed fire as well, but I only do that on a very small scale, and I'm mostly just a fiscal partner. And then planting degraded habitat is also important. So I've done a little bit of that as well. And within the context of starting this program, it really started with one partner, and that's the Tamarac National Wildlife Refuge. And I'll show you where that is in a couple minutes. But so to start small and build something that lasts and goes from, one partner to all across northern Minnesota, you really have to trust the process and start small. And get your initial projects done, embrace the science-based best management practices that you have, learn who those contractors are, who can implement what your habitat prescriptions are. And then you have to sell the process to those partners because they will not have worked with you yet. So I put in here door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesman because that's kind of what you are. You call up partners and send out emails and help identify areas and build upon those initial projects and utilize those successes to build your others in the future. So developing quality professional relationships and engaging partners is very important. I tend to be the guy who calls people directly. It's sort of an inside joke among some people. I do email, of course, but there's just something to be said about talking to people in person, talking out what you hope to do together, learning what local contractors can complete the work. Engaging those partners at multiple levels is really important. I'll go out into the field with biologists and foresters to take a look at prospective project sites and work with them via GIS and Zoom to take a gander at what might be suitable for habitat work. But I also speak with administrators and form larger partnerships and collaboratives so that the conservation community has forums where they can interact and help each other plan and collaborate instead of compete across the landscape. So inviting prospective and current partners to join you in the field, I just can't tell you how important that is. Going and seeing a site that could have work done, or a site that has already had work done and has some results, maybe has had some observed occupation by your target species, and seeing that with your partners is just incredibly satisfying. It's great stuff. There's sometimes, events or workshops that you can tie in with some of those visits. And that way too, like as a program and as part of a collaborative effort, it's not just the acres that you accomplish, but the acres you can influence down the line. So it's good to create and share realistic, achievable goals, which is my next bullet here, but it's also good to inspire those people you work with so that when they do their own work in the field, they'll take into account the things they've learned from you, and you'll do the same with the things you learned from them. And that's how you really build upon your individual successes and have rippling effects across the landscape that are positive for not just your target species, but a suite of species, because there's so many different things that in Minnesota we manage for at the intersection of multiple ecological provinces. So learning how you can assist in some of those other initiatives is incredibly important as well. That could be, helping with a volunteer event. It could be, a fiscal agent for some work being done, maybe a CPL grant. There's lots of different ways that you can support each other, even if it doesn't fall within the main vein of a conservation focus. And that's how you become a part of a community. So dedication and hard work really do produce results. provide regular communication. One email just doesn't cut it. Work overtime, embrace the science, and continue to learn. I had that in multiple spots in here, I realized, but learn something from each project and expand your skill set. Because when you are in my field, grant writing, research, GIS, ecology, biology, there's always more to learn, not just in, my target habitats, but stacking, conservation initiatives and objectives throughout multiple habitats and cover types across the landscape is just so important to, and understanding how all of those work together and how different phases of a life cycle might have different requirements for different species. Just the quality of work ends up going up. So remain a student forever and embrace being a teacher, because as you learn, it'll be important to share. And as you're out in the field, you will always learn something if you keep your ears open and ask questions. So research and monitoring are essential. They're going to be teaching us long into the future and constantly telling us how we can improve our work and adapt to new things we learn. I have work overtime in here as well. That's very important. Sometimes, especially when contractors are in the field, you're just not going to have the time to to talk to them during the day because they're going to be completing your work. So, be flexible, because sometimes you just need to put in that extra effort to get it done. We're all trying to create diversity at multiple scales across jurisdictional boundaries on public and private lands. And to that end, ABC has complementary programs on both public and private lands and engages partners not just within the context of like the state agencies, but private landowners as well. That habitat program is expanding into Wisconsin and Michigan. Jeff has done the same in Appalachia. So encouraging cooperation rather than competition is very important. So I'll get into a couple forums where the conservation community comes together to talk about what they've done and engage partners and support for different efforts like applications to the Outdoor Heritage Fund or other regional initiatives. So I guess I say it twice here, but supporting research and monitoring and getting better at what you do is always important, and it is important to maybe say twice. So become a resource to your partners and take on the additional responsibilities, because that's really what's going to get things across the finish line. Mutual support and respect are just the keys to long-lasting collaborations. And so to that end, we started just right here. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer. Maybe you've seen it the whole time. In Tamarac National Wildlife Refuge, just an excellent partner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And since then have expanded to county, state, federal agencies across the state. And the Red Lake Banded Chippewa has been a huge partner to us as well. Just really, I can't overstate just how important those partners are to the success of our program. Their willingness to work with me to identify sites and implement projects on the ground is the key to success. And, we've done some great work together, and that makes them eager to want to work together again in the future. But it takes a community. So always remember that as you're working. We're closing in on 10,000 acres. We're in phase 3. Phase 1 and 2 expanded its work in both phases. So we really did start small. I believe my first year I did about 400 acres, and this year I have over 1,000 targeted. And our private lands program in Minnesota has done equally great work in that same time. So I'm also a part of additional collaborative forums. The East Central Landscape Committee, I helped, I worked with them and was a part of the revision of their East Central Landscape Plan. Forestry for Minnesota Birds is a really, embryonic initiative here in Minnesota, and is trying to emulate the success of Forestry for Maine Birds and a similar initiative in Michigan to provide tools to natural resource managers and private landowners for completing work for species of greatest conservation need. a part of the Chippewa National Forest Resource Advisory Committee and the North Central Forest Birds Network. And I'm not just saying these things to like show what I've done. I'm saying these things because I want to show how even as a small restoration enhancement program, that's grown to have a larger footprint because of my partners. A lot of that is because I give as much as I get. So being a part of these groups and forwarding some of their initiatives and being a part of that, even on my free time, it really has helped me grow my own program and is kind of the keys to success, not just for a program, but for conservation initiatives in general, because the ideal scenario is complementary. The greatest accomplishment from a collaborative perspective, and at least that I have, is being a part of creating and overseeing the Minnesota Forest Habitat Collaborative. It's a roundtable community forum to identify, promote, and deliver collaborative conservation, outreach, and research programs that assist natural resource managers across jurisdictional and ownership boundaries to maintain, enhance, and restore Minnesota's forests for the benefit of associated resident and migratory species. I know that's kind of a mouthful. Really, it's a group of agencies, NGOs, just looking to work together and provide support for each other. Really an information sharing group as well. And I can't say enough about all the good people around the table there, from, again, NGOs, agencies like the DNR, TNC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, just so many great people, counties, state, federal. And collaboration doesn't only exist with the implementation, but also the creating of the BMPs that we utilize. So their GWWA working group, with the assistance of a consortium of more than 140 biologists and managers, engaged the research and created the BMPs. I know Jeff had a hand in that as well. And without that initial collaboration, we wouldn't be where we are today. I don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'm going to quick skip over some of this, but just kind of show you some of the work that's done as I take my last couple minutes up here. I work in contiguous forest habitat, deciduous forest matrix. That mix can get up to about 30% or so of conifer forest, but that adjacent forest is important for additional stages of the life cycle, especially golden wings. They nest in these young forest openings. This is immediately after treatment. You can see how important in a timber, I kind of couple timber harvest and brush management objectives together, because there a lot of trees are included in my sites. And so they utilize some of these trees for song perches. They'll nest next to woody shrubs as they regenerate. They need those openings in order to actually utilize the site. So that's why some of the cutting takes place. But you can see diversity is king. Always advocating for leaving more, retaining more on the landscape. And this is an adjacent cut that, that Tamarac did 4 years later. So what we also did is we worked together to write a small CPL grant and implement a, I'm not sure if you can see the legend here, but this is a fire break. So this area is also going to be maintained in the future via prescribed fire. So this initial cutting probably won't take place necessarily again, and it'll be maintained by prescribed fire and let kind of natural succession take place within the context of that. There's some woody fuel reduction up here. So you see there's a little bit more cutting in the north, so that prescribed fire could actually be used. But again, retention is so much higher within the context of these sites than you might see in other areas. These are the areas that I kind of go into, just a very dense brush. And from there, do some cutting with strategic retention, tons of not only brush and not only trees, which you see in the previous slides at the satellite imagery, but brush, which is harder to make out, and really leave a mosaic, which as it begins to regenerate, just has diversity at multiple scales and across the vertical and horizontal level. So ABC's conservation goal is to benefit a suite of species and promote dynamic mosaic of ages and cover types throughout the landscape. And again, it's all about who you work with, and standing on the shoulders of the great research that has helped point the direction that you should travel with your conservation prescriptions. And I just want to thank everyone for their time. I hope I didn't use too much extra.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate that. That's a great story. And Jeff, if you're ready to present, go ahead and jump on. And it's bridging off of Peter's discussion on collaborations. Take it away, Jeff.
I was muted. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, great. All right. So thanks for inviting me to speak about all of the results of the monitoring that we've been doing and continue to do. Great. Always great to hear Peter and talking about the accomplishments of the partnership out there. I sit here in a chair in Western Pennsylvania. I've had opportunities to visit Minnesota, and in fact, in 2013, I'm proud to say I was one of the individuals that made a very, very wise decision. I was invited to be on the hiring committee for Peter's position, and I think we made a really excellent decision there. And I'm so proud over the last 8 years to see what Peter's been able to build from the 400-acre initial year to what he and the partnership has accomplished. For me, it's rewarding to be a part of this because I have a master's in forestry and a PhD in wildlife, and to be able to be involved with a recovery program that puts me on the front line on the science side of things and developing best management practices, working with folks to implement those best management practices, and then being able to evaluate and refine those best management practices. And I hope you'll get a little bit of a taste of that here today. And I recognize my many, as Peter mentioned, no different from implementation, from a monitoring and research perspective. It really does take a diverse partnership to be able to do the good things that we need to be doing. Let's see here. For some reason, we are not advancing. One moment. Was working before we came on live. Let's see if this will work. Yeah, okay. Disaster averted. So Peter spoke a little bit about the ecology of the golden-winged warbler. For today, this is I guess the star of the show and what a lot of folks are worried about. Currently being considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act, requires that for heavily forested landscape and quite a bit of structural complexity within the nesting habitat, and then of course in the surrounding forest. So with its decline, there has been a lot of attention. There continues to be a lot of attention to study the animal's ecology, both from a demographic response to management and just the understanding of general ecology of the species. With that, the Golden-winged Warbler Working Group conducted a multi-year study, and at the end of that, drafted a conservation plan for the species. And also along with that were various best management practice or habitat guidelines that were developed. So these science-based guidelines that were founded and built upon the science across a diverse breeding season geography. And then, of course, the science continues. We continue to learn more about the species over the last decade. Certainly, this warbler is one of the most studied warblers at this point in time, and of course makes a great species for which we can implement some interesting recovery programs and sound science-based programs. And you folks are doing that in Minnesota, and we'll talk about two such programs and the outcomes of those programs here today. what Peter just mentioned, the public lands, what I will call the public lands effort or the shrublands effort. And then, of course, the private lands effort, which has been underway since 2015 in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And that's really modeled after a sister program, Working Lands for Wildlife, in the eastern states, whereby the Golden-winged Warbler is one of the primary, what we call Working Lands for Wildlife 1.0 species. So what I'm here to talk about today is just basically share the results of monitoring that was aimed at answering a primary question, that being what drives successful outcomes for habitat programs that target golden-winged warblers. And we're very fortunate that we had a couple of big funders here that helped us with this heavy lift, because when you think about the geography of the Appalachians all the way to the Western Great Lakes, even though I'll just be talking about Minnesota primarily today, the expense of a quality monitoring program is significant, or can be significant, and we're very appreciative of the funders. So to answer that question, we studied two early successional community types: managed shrublands, what Peter just described here in his previous talk. And then, of course, under the NRCS program, the Regional Conservation Partnership, we monitored golden-winged warblers, associated species in primarily timber harvests, recovering timber harvests or regenerating timber harvests that looked a little bit like this. Really quickly to get through the methods, remember, we are implementing science-based documents. We're implementing documents that are based on reproductive success and what we learned from a multi-year study. We implement those plans, and we assume that the implementers are implementing the conservation guidelines appropriately. And we want to see if the species are actually using those particular sites. So that is why our primary mechanism is monitoring through point counts, so standard avian survey method. We essentially can think about placing a buffer around each managed site, and we put a 80-meter buffer around the edge of that so that we can eliminate any kind of edge effects. And then we place a random point within the area of interest. And then we also ensure that we're never monitoring points that are closer than 250 meters apart. In most cases, one management footprint has one monitoring point, so it's not really ever an issue. Usually they're far further apart than 250 meters. So it's a point count survey, 10 minutes in length. We visit each point twice. The observers record the distance the golden-winged warbler was to the observer in that 10-minute period. After a point count season's done, we get right in there immediately following, and we do a pretty detailed field-based vegetation survey at each point. Basically a 100-meter radius around each point, 3 transects radiating from that point, and we quantify various vegetation structure attributes of that stand. And we also, for our timber harvest study, we also looked at landscape scale influences, and of course use various remote sensing data layers in order to populate our variable or covariate list. So let's hurry up and get into the results. So I'm going to go through the shrubland results first, and then we'll get into the managed forest results. The shrubland results, I should point out, is a manuscript that is about to be submitted. It's going to be led by Anna Buckhard. She's was a graduate student of Amber Roth at the University of Maine. And of course, Amber Roth has ties to the Great Lakes before going to the University of Maine. So we appreciate their collaboration on this. Anna's working with Iowa DNR now, so she couldn't be with us today. Otherwise, I would love to have had her present her results. A lot of sites, this slide shows you across Wisconsin and Minnesota. And the primary, I guess, things to be looking at here is the 55 mature alder, so greater than 25 growing seasons, 453 sheared alder shrublands, and 121 sheared aspen sapling stands. And We used a hierarchical and mixture model analysis that accounted for imperfect detection. We bin those detections into and use the ones that are highlighted in green here, removing the ones that were greater than 100 meters away from the observer. That ended up being like the removal of about not quite 3% of the total detections for golden wings. And we examined two relationships: treatment effect. So thinking about those aspects of the previous slide, and think about that as a management effect, if you will. And then, of course, vegetation effects. And when we look at some general results, we had 1,192 male golden-winged warblers detected across our study. The naive occupancy was pretty high. I'm pretty pleased to see this, where we see 80, 70, and 79% of those various treatment types being occupied by male golden-winged warblers. And if we look at the first model for shrublands, which was the management model, so looking for a treatment effect, the only variable that was found to be important in that top model was management status. So no management of shrublands versus management of shrublands. And you can see that management certainly resulted in an increase in the abundance of golden-winged warbler on these sites. If we look at model set number 2, the vegetation effect, we had of course, one top model and one competing model. The top model having the quadratic form for shrub cover and sapling cover. So you can see they have this kind of sweet spot, if you will, for those particular woody vegetation features. And also a quadratic form of bare ground, which is a little bit harder for me to get my head wrapped around, because you don't generally see quadratic forms having this U-shaped pattern. I suspect that when you have lots of sapling and shrub cover in an area, then of course you have lots of opportunities for low shade, and low shade removing a lot of that herbaceous component from the ground layer. So I can conceptualize that a little bit, but I will admit that upside down U is something that is a bit awkward. The competing model, again, had the quadratic form of shrub cover and sapling cover, and the third, or I should say a fourth variable of canopy cover. And I should say that all of these variables none of these variables overlap 0. The beta coefficients and the standard deviation did not overlap 0, so that we do consider them very meaningful results. So reduced number of tree cover, we would see a negative relationship with tree cover and golden-winged warbler abundance. Moving along, just to give you a little bit of an example, here is the site on the left is a site that was, this is like 3 months after treatment, 4 months after treatment. So it was treated in the winter, and then the first July after that treatment, you can see what we have on the left. And then 1 year later, so we're talking about July, and we're or late June, we're talking about a growing season and a part, right? And you can see just how quickly the vegetation at these sites recover after treatment. Quickly move on to the managed forest part of the study. This was DJ McNeil's dissertation research at Cornell. He is now Dr. McNeil, and he is a professor at the University of North Carolina, otherwise, and teaching right now. So otherwise he would have been here. So I'm kind of like honored to be able to present the results of 2 individuals that have done a really exceptional job of helping us understand golden wing response. So here are the study sites. These are all overstory removal / clear cut timber harvests. Really quickly, very similar analysis, although this is a hierarchical distance-based analysis. See 237 unique locations. And we had this vegetation and a landscape effects model. And of course, we use the AIC criteria. So these sites were highly occupied, which is great. Even initially after management, you can see our first year of monitoring, we had over a 70 or about a 70% occupancy rate. And as those sites that were monitored 3 years in a row succeeded and developed, you see occupancy rate increase. And we looked at, in the paper in restoration ecology, we looked at density. And this is a predictive map of our study area with respect to golden-winged warbler density, and that red being densities of greater than 1.5 males per hectare. And the two most important features, one from a veg perspective, and that was the number of growing seasons post-management. So post-harvest was the number one most important variable in our modeling at the site level perspective. And at the landscape level, it was mixed forest in the landscape with a negative relationship. The more mixed forest you had in the landscape, the lower the golden-winged warbler abundance in the Great Lakes. So the question, if we restore the habitat, will the focal species golden-winged warbler come? And the answer is in the Great Lakes, certainly with, we didn't present the modeled occupancy, but by year 3, we're talking about a 90% occupancy of restored sites. Managed shrublands had high occupancy, higher occupancy, had higher abundance than unmanaged shrublands. That's an important take home. The abundance and density did vary, though. There were certainly things that influenced abundance and density across these landscapes, whether it be a timber harvest or managed shrublands. And both of those analyses identified features that can help us move forward, adapt, revise our best management practices and the way in which we think about conservation frameworks for this species in the Great Lakes. Two things to point out from a improving restoration. We can think about, the variables and how that all kind of was teased out and the importance of time and succession from a timber management perspective or a forest management perspective. Thing to remember with forest management, the take-home message is you start with nothing basically from a golden-winged warbler other than the importance of residual trees, right, across that landscape or across that treated area. And you go into a forest, you don't have that structural complexity in the understory necessarily. So there's going to be necessarily a kind of a waiting out time for the conditions to develop. But when those conditions develop and we go through that succession, golden-winged warblers are certainly showing up in quite abundant. Now, that's not the case with shrubland work, right? And with the shrubland work, we actually have for this kind of like perfect scenario where we only have a lot of shrubs and lots of saplings, but we have the ability to be very, very, deliberate in how we manage these sites and the extent to which we disturb the site and remove some of that woody cover to make the conditions that are more heterogeneous for what golden-winged warblers are looking like across a nesting site. So I think the most important thing is that we have those conversations with operators that, they must go easy on the shearing at first. It's not a lawnmower, and it's one thing that we have to keep in mind and keep communicating with our landowners. And it's, Peter's point of going out on the site and visiting these places with operators is an essential part of that capacity. And then I'm just going to finish up. I'm not even going to go over this. I just want you to know that we've been monitoring a lot of species in relationship or taxa in relationship to the work that folks have been doing in Minnesota, including American woodcock and native pollinators, particularly the monarch butterfly. High occupancy. You can look at the shrubland versus the timber harvest with respect to woodcock and see they're both function about the same with respect to their capacities to support singing woodcock males. It's important to note that, we also see the evidence of the benefits of these stands when they start to become a little bit older, right? Woodcock nests here on the ground just below the fingertip. So singing grounds, habitat in close proximity to those dense sapling stands that the species needs to nest in. Just this year, Emma Keel, a graduate student of mine here at IUP, finished her long, summer-long field work that looked at monarch response. Monarch is a working lands for wildlife species in your part of the world, and we just wanted to understand how work for golden-winged warbler would benefit this species. Here's the study sites that Emma visited, aspen shearing and alder shearing. And then we're comparing that with data from the Monarch joint venture as a kind of the gold standard, if you will. And this is basically the features that we were collecting during this particular study. She sampled every once a month, all of these sites, all the way through the latter part of August. And I'm not going to get into this because I want to leave time for us to have a nice conversation, but these are some of the preliminary results. And I encourage you to have Emma join us in a future webinar to be able to discuss her findings. Again, she's just finished her field season, so she's not quite ready, but by this time next year for sure. And I just want to thank everyone that contributes to the wonderful work y'all are doing out there. The monitoring is evidence that your model is working. You have a great group of collaborators that's allowing us to kind of live the conservation dream, I believe. Being able to kind of take that science, implement it, and monitor, and go back into those plans and kind of rework things where necessary. And of course, we thank the private landowners and all of the field technicians that are integral to the work that we do. And a big shout out to Dwayne and Peter and Kevin, my ABC colleagues, because this work is not easy. And it does take a lot. It's more of a vocation. And I love it when I get a text message at 7 o'clock at night and they have questions about the work we're doing, and we can have those conversations. So hats off to you all. And I look forward to taking any questions that you might have.
Hi, Peter and Jeff. Thanks for your great presentations. We have a couple questions that we can start with, but I hope everybody in the panel or in the audience will start contributing some additional questions. First of all, Peter, you mentioned that as part of your work, the outreach, is learning what the local contractors can do. Do you have any advice for working with local contractors that might be new to restoration work, and then building capacity with local contractors?
So contractors are kind of ever shifting. So you need to work with, trust that they, identifying ones that care and that you can speak to about, what your target, especially in my case, retention is great. But going out there, let them work for a day or a few hours. Go out there and visit them in the field, see what they've done, talk about, contractors, especially brush cutters, tend to, they want to mow the lawn because it's what they're used to. It's what's fast. It's like, no, we don't want to do that. We're trying to retain more. So it's a never ending conversation, and just take a hammer on anvil approach. We want more. We want that, it's never about getting mad at somebody. It's about talking it through, and it starts to, look really good, really fast. And some of them hit it right on. But you also want to be careful too of not swinging the pendulum too far, because eventually you can have a contractor go, well, I don't even know what you want anymore because I'm leaving this and then I'm taking that. And so work with those local agencies, especially. Identify who they're using as contractors. What have they done? Some, timber stand improvement work or brush cutting work. I try to use local contractors, but in some cases, I'll need a contractor that has a slightly larger machine. So understanding what the equipment is. It has to be tracked because all of our work, especially on wetlands in the shrubs, takes place during frozen ground conditions, which I rely on my agency, foresters and biologists, to tell me, because how conditions in Minnesota can be different everywhere. So it really just comes from an ever ongoing conversation and having the lines of communication open, and having examples like pictures of what you've done in the past that you think are ideal scenarios. Things that people can look at and interact with are really the best. And yeah, that's about it.
Thanks for that. That was helpful. Can you speak to, I'm going to stick with Peter here for the moment, but can you speak to how you've initiated some of your new partnerships? So when you have to reach out to either a new public agency or to private landowners that you identify as optimal targets, how do you initiate your relationships?
So I usually start with an email, and when that goes unanswered, I call people up, and it doesn't happen anymore. But when people didn't necessarily know American Bird Conservancy or our program, we had a couple partners on the landscape that we had already spoken to in advance of getting our phase 1 funding. But you just call them back. Everyone is in this field is so busy. It's not about the fact that they don't want to speak to you. So having that knowledge and saying like, okay, people don't give you the cold shoulder in this field because they don't want to talk to you. They give you the cold shoulder because they're so darn busy, and it's not intentional. So as long as you give them a buzz back and then, provide them, in my case, with the conservation plan and the science related to what you're looking to do, and relate that to what they're doing and how you can fit those puzzle pieces together. That's really what it comes down to. And then once you have them there, go give a presentation, tell them and show them what you've done. And then once you have those successful partnerships in place, as you're reaching out to new partners, use those existing partners as a reference. County land commissioners are a great example here in Minnesota of, they all kind of know each other. They do things similarly and yet different, but they're more than willing to give each other a call and talk about, a partner or something like that. The same is true with DNR area offices. And so, engage your partners, yet another reason to be seen and talk to them in person a little bit, because you develop some relationships and then they say, yeah, no problem. Have so-and-so give me a call. I'll tell them what we've done together and you can take it from there.
Great, thank you. I think the next question, you both may have something to contribute to, but we'll start with Jeff. Does it matter what the species, the habitat heterogeneity is composed of? One of our audience suggests that they have lots of Chinese elm and box elder. And so, maybe that's less desirable, but did you notice if that was an important component? And then on top of that, how big of a forest area is sufficient for restoration? Jeff, do you want to unmute?
Yeah.
Well, with respect to the last question, how big of an area? We're kind of a little bit bounded by implementing the BMP, right? So we were necessarily not out there on the extremes. So we operated within a set of guidelines. And all I can say to that is it was size of the treatment was a covariate in the analyses, and it was not important for golden-winged warbler. For American woodcock, the larger the size of the treatment area, the higher the woodcock abundance, singing male abundance. And with respect to species composition, and you were asking particularly box elder and?
Yeah, and Chinese elm.
In Chinese elm.
I think it was Chinese elm.
I can't say.
Those two particular species may not have been a problem for you, but did you find any differences related to species?
No, I can say that I wouldn't say that we examined the species composition all that closely, though. When we're thinking about the types of sites, for example, that Peter's selecting to begin with, we're going for a certain set of kind of species composition, right? So alder, aspen saplings, and some willow thrown into the mix. So again, the one difference here is we're going off of a set of BMPs, and those best management practices are guiding kind of the initial parameters of the sites in which we're working at. So not necessarily a focus of the monitoring.
Jeff, do you have or Peter, excuse me, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, speaking to that, I think, golden wings in particular, do love leaf rolling caterpillars. So certain species that maybe have an incidence, a higher incidence of Lepidoptera might be appropriate, those caterpillar species. That's why aspen, it tends to be a good target species. And a lot of the sites that I work on have a ton of interior tree species associated with them, both upland and lowland. So I do, I don't tend to count individuals, but getting a general assessment of where that conifer threshold is, around 30% or so, you start to see diminishing returns. That's a little bit different interior and adjacent to your target project area. So, as you start to rise, especially to like that 50% level, you start to see diminishing returns among the occupancy and abundance.
Yeah, and getting to that, can keep it to that species perspective. You looked at our landscape analysis of those timber harvest sites, and you remember the red was mostly below and kind of like to the southwestish of the Golden-winged area in Minnesota. As you kind of go, from the nose of Superior up toward, I guess, what would it be, Lake of the Woods or something? I'm not very familiar with the geography.
The Arrowhead area, yeah.
Okay. You kind of get into that boreal transition, right? So your landscape is becoming a little bit more dominated by coniferous forests. And so at that scale of investigation, we certainly saw that species matters, forest community matters.
I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question really quick. Does the time frame of the time after treatment, that post-treatment period, how long can you sustain the habitat? And is it sustained well enough with fire that it can sustain the populations? And maybe Jeff, yeah.
I'll talk real quick, but Peter can certainly answer this a little bit better since he's on the ground there. But I would say, certainly managing with fire, we do it here in Pennsylvania, and it is a wonderful tool. We do it in Tennessee. We do it in many places. I think that fire in the importance from a golden-winged warbler conservation perspective is underappreciated. I think of it more as the fire bird, to be honest with you. And we can get there. In some cases, we just need to use mechanical treatments, whether it be brush shearing or timber harvests, to get the basal area or the woody stem density down to kind of like get it molded into the kind of general shape of what we're looking for, and then use that most cost-effective form of prescribed fire to just treat the same acres over a certain rotation of fire, which doesn't need to be every year for sure.
And that will create a dynamic mosaic. Part of we have a shifting landscape of ages, cover types, and in certain areas are going to react different ways to different burns. Initially, just to get the fire to penetrate an area, you might need to go in and do some shearing, or I often use a brush head, so it's mulched up a little bit. And then fire can, do some of that work for you. If you're not able to treat with fire for a while, you might have to go in and cut a little bit here and there in different areas. And it really just depends. Every site is different. So I really, engagement with your landscape on the ground is what's going to get you the best results.
And I want to just throw in the one last point there is that we don't necessarily in some of these communities, particularly like timber harvests, right? We don't necessarily want to go in there and restart succession all the time. We want those landowners to have that economic opportunity in the next 40 years. But we also recognize that as those stands move past golden-winged warbler nesting conditions, they become wonderful post-fledging conditions. And, just my recent trip 3 weeks ago, visiting Peter and others in northern Minnesota, visiting some of those older sapling sites where there's just rough grouse galore within those now. There's probably not a nesting golden-winged one anywhere nearby, but they're bringing their fledglings there, and rough grouse are doing just perfectly fine as best as I could tell. So thinking about succession over time is really important.
Yep, and the habitats are ephemeral, so that's totally natural. You might have a management trajectory that is more towards high quality mid and late succession. So it might not be within the context of your specific long-term goals to maintain that as young forest habitat, or open, or brushland habitat, it might actually be a part of what you want to switch the trajectory, in which case managing for high quality young forest habitat makes a ton of sense. And then, you wouldn't necessarily come in a few years later to maintain it. Sometimes I do that in the brushland setting, but after 10 to 12 years in the forest regeneration setting, you would have a different, plan.
Great. Thanks, Peter and Jeff. Really appreciate your presentations and your perspective on managing landscapes for golden-winged warblers.